not native British. I'm a dual British-American citizen, and I was raised and trained as a journalist in America. And it was largely because of that I was used to getting a lot of my information as a journalist from public records. And when I went to Britain, I thought the two countries were quite similar, but when I went to Britain, all of the records that I was used to having access to were off limits in Britain. And a lot of times, it's not even off limits, it was illegal to access them. There's a number of laws that make it, that are prohibitions on disclosure. I think the case of Britain is a pretty interesting example because a lot of the governments around Africa have been very influenced by the way the parliamentary system in Britain. And what I discovered was that despite the myth that a lot of people have about British democracy, when I looked into it, I found an institution that was really incredibly old-fashioned, very paternalistic, and very elitist in terms of the people in power thought they were best placed to decide what was best for everyone else. So I wrote a first book called Your Right to Know, and it was to coincide with the UK's first ever Freedom of Information law, which didn't go into force until 2005. So Britain was one of the last industrialized democracies to get an FOI law. And I don't think that was a coincidence. They really, really didn't like the idea of the masses being able to question their betters. So in that book, I just kind of described all the elements of the British state and the type of information that they held, and who, as much as I could, I tried to name everyone as to who was responsible if you wanted to make an FOI request. And I trained a lot of journalists through the National Union of Journalists, and then I started making all of the requests that I recommended in the book. I made them myself. So I made about 600 to 700 FOI requests all across different parts of the British government. And the reason that Parliament really came to the fore was because they were so obstructive. I made different types of requests, but the one that really kind of took off for me was the one I made for the MP's second home allowance. And that's the allowance that all MPs can claim to come to London during the parliamentary session and do parliamentary business. It's a public, they claim it from the taxpayer. But what was rumoured to be happening was that they were using it to build up a property empire. So they would claim for mortgage payments and to buy a house. And then as they came close to paying that off, they would keep the house, but they would buy another house, and then they would start claiming the maximum mortgage for the second house while they rented out the first one. And there was a lot of other things that we discovered. It took, however, 5 years to get that information released, and it ended up with me and a couple of other journalists going to the High Court in Britain to have that case decided. Even then, it was a whole. This is the main problem for journalists using FOI, is that information decays over time. So not very many journalists have an interest in pursuing a story over 5 years. It takes a certain kind of strange individual, such as an investigative journalist perhaps, to follow a story through that long. And it's got to be a particularly big story. I think, as Nick was saying, it's got to be something that's of pretty big importance, that it's still going to be a story 5 years later, because that is often how long it takes to get these cases decided. Eventually, the information came out, but it didn't come out in the way that I had expected, which was for the Parliament to finally agree and open up the gates, the portcullis, all the information comes out there. In fact, what our Parliament did was they tried to retrospectively change the Freedom of Information law, so it no longer applied to parliamentarians. And that was such a scandal that all of them, amazingly for once, all of the press in Britain united around this outrage and shamed the government and the opposition party. And so they dropped that bill, they dropped that attempt to change the FOI law. But during that time, somebody inside Parliament itself made a copy of the entire digital database of MPs' allowances and sold it to the Daily Telegraph newspaper. And then all the stories came out, which I think went around the world. And I guess it's the importance of the media, because it was a big data set, but what the journalists did was they picked out a number of very important stories, but also very funny stories too. So there was an MP who was claiming to have his moat cleaned. He lived in this giant mansion, and he had a moat, like in a castle, a moat, and he was charging the taxpayer to clean this moat. It was a duck house that one MP had claimed for, among other things. Eventually, 4 MPs were, about 120 MPs left government at the last election over this scandal. And 4 MPs and 2 Lords were jailed for fraud. And also our House of Commons Speaker had to resign, and he was the first one to do that in 300 years. So it really, it also got rid of the previous party, and we had a new party coming to power. So it was a pretty dramatic, I guess it shows that it does take a long time when you do these FOI requests, that they can be pretty revolutionary.
Very well.